Hey guys, and welcome. I am really excited today as we are covering a super important topic that so many of you have been asking us for help with, and it's all about the legal side, your insurance, your refunds, your postponements, this huge area that all of you are struggling with right now. And we have brought in an expert because I am not an expert on these subjects. And so I would love to introduce you to our good friend Will. Hi Will, thanks for joining me.
Hi.
Could you tell us, Will, who you are, what you do, and how you're going to help us today?
Yeah. Hi. Well, I'm Will Christopher. I'm a dispute resolution lawyer. So hopefully any disputes that might arise out of this, I'll be able to assist with. I'm at a firm called Kingsley Napley, and as I say, disputes is all I deal with. So hopefully we'll be able to get some clarity to all the questions that you've got.
Perfect. And we actually asked our online community for their questions in advance so that we could address those real specifics for people. And we're going to ask them all completely anonymously because I know for some of these subjects, they're a little bit delicate, aren't they? And so I'm just going to go through all of the questions that our lovely community have sent over to us. So Will, are you ready to help us out with this subject?
I am. Hit me.
Okay, so let's start off. So we're going to go in a few blocks, aren't we? Let's start off with insurance because this is a massive one. One of the things that we got asked so much from our venues and suppliers was why are the insurance companies not actually paying out? And what they have been doing is they're telling customers to ask for the money back from suppliers and venues. But obviously from a business point of view, this is disastrous, catastrophic. And so we're wondering what is going on with these insurance companies and why are they doing that?
Well, I mean, the first thing you've got to remember is that insurance companies, their business model is to try and avoid paying out claims. So that's what they're trying to do. And just dealing with a few specifics in an insurance contract, they are probably going to have to cover for this. But most, if not all, insurance companies and insurance policies will have a clause in there that requires their insured to mitigate their loss. And what that means is they've got to try and recover their losses themselves before they claim on the insurance. And so that's what's going on here, is that the insurers are going through that stage before they start paying out. So if you follow that,
key, isn't it, for our suppliers and venues to understand? It's almost a tick box exercise, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if having done that, refunds aren't available, or the contracts that are in place enable venues to hold on to deposits or do not require them to pay money back, then the insurance company is going to have to pay out. But it's as you say, a tick box exercise and taking things in stages.
That is so useful. Guys, if you're watching this and you found that useful, please let us know in the comments below, because for me, I didn't understand that at all. And I think that is absolutely the brilliant point to start off with. So what support can our venues and suppliers get when the insurance companies are not cooperating with them? Is there support?
Not really. I mean, you've just got to open a channel of communication with your insurers and be persistent, because that will pay off in both senses of the word, because the insurance companies, if the wording is clear, they will have to pay out because it's a contract. Okay. So yeah, be persistent if you think you've got a claim.
And so there's a couple of words that people have asked us to elaborate on in their contracts and in their insurance contracts. So force majeure, what does that actually mean? When can they apply it? What is that?
Okay, so force majeure, this is a contractual term, and it refers to a supervening event that is beyond the control of the parties. And
like coronavirus?
Like coronavirus, and which occurs after the contract is signed. Okay. And now, unlike frustration, which we'll come on to in a minute, which is a way to bring a contract to an end, force majeure has to be an express term in the contract. And so, there may be specifics in there about what a force majeure event is, what effect a force majeure event has on the performance of the contract. But the key thing is that it needs to be expressly in the contract for people to be able to rely on it.
Okay, so it only applies if, of course, they had it in the first place. And you mentioned their frustration, and so this is another term. It's not just how we feel, is it?
No, it isn't a term. That's in contrast to force majeure. It isn't a contract term. It is it is just one of the ways that a contract can be brought to an end, and it's a legal concept. And for a contract to be frustrated, again, the event must occur after the contract has been formed. It must be so fundamental as to be regarded both by the law as striking at the root of the contract and as entirely beyond what was contemplated by the parties when they entered into it. It should be not due to the fault of either party, and it should, and this is the really important bit, it should render further performance of the contract impossible, illegal, or making it radically different for that contemplated by the parties at the time of making the contract.
Okay, so how does that apply to our venues and suppliers? How would that come into play?
Well, the position, I think, is probably quite clear. If a wedding was booked after to take place after the lockdown started,
yes, which we have lots of those,
yeah. I mean, clearly that those contracts would almost certainly be frustrated because of the last point, which is that further performance of the contract was rendered impossible by the law that it,
by the law.
Yeah, that it said that these events were not to take place.
Okay, so we're going to come on to, aren't we, refunds in just a second, so that can then play into presumably the frustration part. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay,
perfect. So anything else we should know about insurance before we move on to talk about refunds?
I don't think so. I think, just to repeat, be persistent.
Be persistent. Okay, great. Guys, if you're finding this useful, do make sure you hit the like button. Any questions and comments, do pop them in the comments boxes below. And
sorry, there is one other thing in relation to insurance policies. There's a petition in circulation, I understand, asking the government to intervene in relation to insurance policies and insurers not paying out or being unreasonable. So have a look out for that, because 10,000 signatures require it to be debated in Parliament.
Interesting. Okay, we will definitely look for that one. And we should say, shouldn't we, Will, that obviously everybody's insurance, everybody's contracts, they're all very, very different. And all the businesses are so different that people do need to look at these specifically. And what we're giving is quite generic advice, isn't it? What would be your kind of advice on that point about them kind of dealing with their own specific issues?
You will need to take your own legal advice. That's the thing, because what I can't do is give advice in this interview, because I haven't seen. It is inevitably very fact specific, because it will depend on the contract. It will depend on the events surrounding the contract and how it came to not be possible to perform it, or possibly you could perform it.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is just give that kind of helpful, generic information to help people move forward. But if they do need more, then they should be getting specific legal advice, shouldn't they, based on their business and their contracts. Okay, so we talked about that frustration situation, and that can lead to refunds, can't it? And for most of our venues and suppliers, what they do, and probably most businesses, is they take a deposit, of course, and often that is a year in advance, sometimes 2 years in advance with weddings. So they've taken that deposit, and they may then have a balance due, which of course is not going to happen because the wedding doesn't happen. So do they have to offer the full refund back? Do they have to offer the deposit back? How does that kind of come into play?
Well, again, it will depend on the terms of the contract. So first of all, where the contract has not been frustrated, you look at the terms of the contract, and so there's a 14-day cooling off period normally under the distance selling regulations. That's the cooling off period. And so if you're within that, then if a customer said we want to cancel this, then you would have to give the deposit back.
Okay. But for most of them, that isn't going to be the case, is it? Couples will have booked 12 months ago, and now with the law having not allowed these events to take place, they're in quite a different position.
That's right. So the starting point then would be Normally, a contract would say that no refund is owed to the company to the customer on cancellation. So that would be the starting point. But then the Consumer Rights Act comes into play, and the contract has to be fair and reasonable and transparent to be enforceable. So if the contract is heavily weighted towards the non-consumer, as it were, then it may be that there would be a challenge to such a term that said that deposits were not going to be returnable under that act.
Okay. Oof. It's a complicated minefield, isn't it? Is what we're seeing. There isn't a kind of black and white answer to all of this, is there?
Certainly not. No.
So if let's take a venue. If a venue's contract says in their T's and C's that all payments are non-refundable, which most of my clients who I work with have that kind of contract because they're holding dates, they've booked that date out, the deposits are non-refundable, are they still non-refundable even though we're in this current situation?
Well, that then comes into the question of whether or not the contract has been frustrated. Because if a contract has been frustrated, then it may well be that the money would have to be refunded, possibly less any amount which has already been incurred. So if work has been done in preparation, then the supplier would probably be entitled to charge for that work and return the balance. But for a venue maybe booked sometime in the future, probably nothing has been done. And so if the contract is brought to an end, and no part of it has been performed on the part of the supplier, then probably money would have to be refunded.
Okay, that's really interesting. And again, that's where our venues and suppliers would have different answers, because actually, if they were 3 weeks from the wedding, potentially things had been booked and paid for and ordered, food, flowers. I'm kind of trying to think of those perishable items that actually the supplier venue might have pre-ordered, bottles of wine, etc., etc. And so the closer they were to the date, the more likely they could actually recoup or hold on to the money that for those costs incurred. Have I got that right?
Yeah, well, certainly because if the venue has ordered that from suppliers, then the supplier might be entitled to a refund for that. And equally, if the money had been paid to the venue to supply all of that, then yes, that would probably have to be returned, or would be able to be retained. Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I think again that would be something that our venues and suppliers would find very helpful to understand. Can our suppliers and venues force the couples to postpone and not cancel? I was looking for another word that isn't force, because I know that all of our suppliers and venues love what they do. They love weddings, they love their couples, they love to serve them. But ultimately, if everybody just cancels and refunds everything, there will be a lot of businesses that go under. So can they make their couples postpone?
Well, I think the answer to that is probably no. But equally, there may be no right for the customer to get a refund if they don't do that, because that would interact with the terms of the contract, I think. And so if a venue or all the suppliers are offering to postpone with no charge, which is I think probably going to be the best way to resolve a lot of these.
I think most people are doing
that. Then it becomes a bit of a non-issue. But you can't force the customer to postpone. But the fact that they may lose their money if they don't might prompt them to do so.
Again, very, very helpful point, I think, there for our suppliers and venues to understand. So if they are being reasonable, they're offering other dates, next year or the end of this year, they're being reasonable, offering that postponement. And if the client then turns around and says, no, I want to cancel in the entirety, then it seems like our venues and suppliers could hold that original deposit because the client is then the one cancelling. Is that, have I understood?
Yeah, well, unless there's a frustration event. So again, that plays into that. And then the discussion we had earlier about the money that had been paid over for a partial performance of the contract, that all comes into play. So yeah, tricky. But
it is tricky. How do you do this all day, Will? This is I don't know about the guys watching. I already feel brain frazzled going through, and we've only gone through a couple of questions. How do you do this all day?
Yeah, good question.
Okay.
Hot towels round the head.
Okay, I've got loads more questions for you. So, what if the customer has postponed their ceremony to a date I cannot do? So, am I liable to refund the money already paid because the supplier of venue is now not available?
Yeah, this is again quite a tricky one because all of the things that we've just discussed come into play here. So, and you need to look at all of them. So, for example, were you consulted on the new date? If you weren't and they just went ahead and booked it, then I think you'd have a good argument that you just can't do it. So and that you should have been consulted. But if you were and you couldn't accommodate any of the new dates, then arguably the contract's been frustrated because due to no fault of either party, performance of the contract has become impossible because the original date can't do, and then the alternative other dates can't be done either. And that may well prove to be the case, because I would imagine that all of the weddings that are being postponed at the moment are going to have to find a place in the calendar at some point. So
this is a huge problem for our venues and suppliers, and this is definitely going to be the next challenge for everyone, or is already a challenge, exactly as you say, because a lot of us book 2 years in advance anyway with weddings, and so those dates are already filled up. You know, I know one of the venues I work with, they're incredibly busy, and through summer they already have next year every single day through summer booked, Mondays, Sundays, every day, and so they can't accommodate, and so this is really tricky. And I think that question actually came from a florist, the one we just asked you about them not being able to accommodate, because our couples are going straight to the venue to check what those dates are, taking the new date on the venue, and then going to DJs, florists, venue dressers and saying this is my new date, and of course they can't all accommodate that. And I think that's going to be a real loss for some of those suppliers because they won't be able to carry the new date. So to re-clarify, do they have to give the deposit back because they can't do the new date if they were offered the dates but couldn't do them?
Well, again, this comes back to what the contract says and whether that contract is fair and transparent. Okay. And if the contract provides for the deposit to be non-refundable and the contract is fair and transparent, then you don't have to give the deposit back. Again, if the full amount has been paid, then different considerations come into play there.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Next question. A client cancelled a wedding booking 24 hours before the event, but before the government banned weddings. So they chose to cancel their event. Yep. Are they entitled to a refund? I've offered them an alternative date at no additional cost, but they now intend to do a very small wedding with just a few guests. So they cancelled before the law changed.
Yeah. So I think here there would not be a frustrating event because they could have gone ahead. I mean, particularly where you've got the Prime Minister and his girlfriend attending the England and Wales rugby match, and you've got Cheltenham going ahead, and so you've got all these big sporting events going ahead.
Yeah. And
so there is no legal reason why that couldn't have gone ahead. I mean, you might have been deciding to be very cautious, but that's not. It's not an impossibility, which is what frustration would look at. So in that scenario, I think the contract is still live, and the provisions in the contract about the sort of time of cancellation and when amounts can be refunded, I think would come into play. And so if it's 24 hours before, then the terms and conditions will probably say there's no refund in those circumstances, so no refund.
Yeah, I would agree. I think majority of our venues and suppliers would definitely have contracts that have 100% prepaid at least a few weeks before, and certainly 24 hours before. I don't know any venues or suppliers who send invoices after. It's always before with weddings. And so if they cancelled 24 hours before, it wasn't a legal requirement, then this supplier doesn't have to give them a refund. But he is being flexible and offering alternative dates. So I think he's doing everything he can there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else we need to cover with refunds that we should know, or have we covered some? We've definitely covered some big ground on that one.
I think we probably have, and some quite complicated legal scenarios as well. But yeah, I think we're okay with that.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions from suppliers and venues with regards to rearranging events and dates. So I would love you to help us with that, and I'm sure this is going to resonate with lots of our viewers. One supplier said they're offering a no fee reschedule within 12 months, which I think lots of people are, because it's hard to charge, isn't it, for changing the date. Do they have to extend the time period? So they're allowing that reschedule within 12 months, but should it be more?
Well, my initial reaction to this was no, and 12 months seems like a very reasonable period. But having discussed earlier how congested the calendar might get, it may be the case that you would have to extend for longer than that, because if you've booked 2 years in advance, then there may not be dates available for another 2 years. So I think suppliers are going to just have to take a view on that and see what they think about it. But there's no legal requirement. It's just commercial considerations.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I think that question actually plays into our next one, because of course what's happening is, if we're backing up all the dates with previously booked revenue, we don't have new dates to take new revenue. And again, what we don't want is our industry going under, because that's not good for anyone. And so I think that's the other issue. And that actually is really interesting, because we had another question, which again, I'm so sure so many venues, especially venues, will struggle with. And the question is this: due to limited availability, some couples are having to take the cheaper dates. And we all know Saturdays are at a premium, summer months are in a premium. You know, a Tuesday in November is going to cost you much less than a Saturday in June. Most of us work in that kind of calendar yield way. So if they had that Saturday in June and they're now having to take a Tuesday in November, which could be the difference of a few thousand, are the couple entitled to claim the difference back because they're now taking a cheaper date?
Yeah, well, I'm going to say, like a true lawyer, it depends on a number of things. Okay. So does the contract provide for a postponement of the wedding? And so if it does, then you look at the approach governed by those contract terms.
It probably doesn't. I don't think many of us, because we're so not used to it, because wedding dates are always fixed. And so we generally don't have this. And that's probably something we need to think about for the future, isn't it?
I think it probably is. Yeah.
We'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah. So then I think you've got to look at what the situation was when the wedding was. Because if it's within a lockdown period where they are just not permitted, then the contract's likely to have been frustrated, and so all of the consequences of that we discussed earlier will come into play. And so if you're offering to postpone and do it on another date, it might feel like you are postponing the same contract, but what is actually happening is that the contract's coming to an end and you're negotiating a new contract. So at that point, you would probably have to return the money, and they would then have to pay again, but they would pay depending on when your pricing structure was. So actually, in legal terms, what you're looking at is probably a new contract, and you'd have to think about what your pricing structure with that. Well,
absolutely. That's really interesting, and definitely for venues, I think that's an important one. So if they did have something in about postponing to different dates and not having any change in price, then that's okay.
Yeah, subject to the act that I mentioned earlier, the Consumer Rights Act, where if those clauses are fair and transparent, then they will govern the contract.
Okay, that makes sense. Phew, some big stuff here, guys. Do let me know any questions, comments in the boxes below. We do want to hear from you. Okay, this is a really interesting one. We deal, and I love a stat, our wedding couples actually deal with venues and suppliers 80% by email, because people don't like to get on the phone anymore. And so we do have a lot of emails back and forth between our venues and our suppliers, both when we're booking and when we're arranging. And one of our community has asked, is an email the same as a contract, because if you've got that exchange of emails, is it as binding as a signed piece of paper if they put it in black and white in an email? I often do not have the client's address. Is it necessary to include that on the email?
Okay, I'll deal with that one at a time, if I may. So yes, a contract can be made by an exchange of emails. It can be made orally. For it to be binding, you must have an offer, acceptance, consideration, some form of payment, and something going the other way, an intention to be legally bound, and certainty as to what the parties have agreed. And that can all be present in an exchange of emails. What is definitely the case, though, is it is slightly more difficult to work out what the terms of the contract are from an exchange of emails rather than just one written document. And it's also the case that you might have looser language, and so there might be things missing. So there may be things that you would have to imply into the contract in that scenario. So the short answer is yes. It is as binding as a document.
That's good to know.
Absolutely, but with regard to a customer's address, again, there's no requirement for you to know what the customer's address is for the contract to be binding. But there's a practical point here, which is where are you going to serve any proceedings on? If you need to enforce any of the terms of the contract, you would need to know where they are to be able to do that.
So I suspect this question is thinking something different. So for most of us, we would have had that initial formal contract, which does have their address on. I think their question is that on the email, the address isn't there, but on the original contract, it probably is. So as long as they've got that original one with their address on, then they would know, presumably, where to follow up with the client. But I think that's going to be really reassuring for a lot of our venues and suppliers to know that actually if they've had that email exchange, that counts. If they've agreed that postponement or that change of price or whatever it is, or the change of numbers, there's lots of things that counts on that email exchange. That's kind of what you're saying, isn't it? Although there could be loopholes, of course.
Yeah,
great, love that. Okay, so what about afterwards? It's hard, isn't it? We can't predict the future, but people are saying, when do we think we're going to be able to host weddings again? Because obviously they are a big public gathering mostly, although private events is slightly different. Of course, in churches, they are public gatherings. Any crystal ball to tell us when we're going to be able to do this?
No. It's going to depend on when the government changes the law. And it's very difficult to see when that might be, particularly when they're not testing people at the moment.
Yeah.
So I just have no idea.
Okay. And finally, again, thinking about planning for the future, and we just touched on this a few questions back, what should they be doing now in terms of their T's and C's? And I went through this with one of my venue clients. It's a group I work with. They have 41 hotels here in the UK. And I was talking them through some of those extra T's and C's that they now want to put in, thinking about this moving forward, because potentially this could happen either again or will be with us for a while, on and off. Lockdown comes on, lockdown comes off. Are there some key things really they need to fact check into their contract?
I think it's really sensible to review terms and conditions with this having happened, because it's slightly bolting the stable door locking the stable door after the horse is bolted. But equally, I think your point's a very good one, that there could be sort of rolling lockdowns, and we could get locked down again. So it's definitely worth looking at that, and so it's all of these slightly grey areas. You can provide for that in the contract, subject to the Consumer Rights Act and them needing to be fair and transparent. So there's no point in constructing a contract which is just not going to be enforceable, because you'll potentially alienate your customer, and even if they sign up to it, it might not be enforceable. So you've got to bear that in mind as well. But I can't see any reason why you shouldn't look at ways to express in the contract what happens if this happens again.
Yeah, I know one of the things that I was working on with a different client was adding in an extra flexible item to the contract, which is that actually you can reschedule once within a 12-month period to help that confidence of the couples to book, with in mind that this might be going on and off for a while, and actually giving more flexibility in our contracts. But then, of course, like you were talking about before, what that then means if that happens, and the price points for the different days, because they can then think ahead to that, can't they, and get that all covered in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really sensible. And but again, I'd say it, and I would say this because I'm a lawyer, but do take legal advice on this, because it will that will help you to express precisely what it is that you want to, and make sure that you're not going to fall foul of the Consumer Rights Act.
Perfect. Well, I've learned loads. I have learned loads. Well, this has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your advice and help with us. And again, we've said it a couple of times, guys, do look at your own contracts. You know, everybody's business and contract and insurance is completely different. So do take a look at that. And as Will has said, take legal advice if you do need it. But hopefully we have answered a few of your questions. And so thank you so much for watching. Will, thanks so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.